Alrighty. So for this episode, it's going to be with my third cousin, Gerry Dinkins, who's a good family friend of ours, um, and I guess a member of the family. I didn't even realize we were related until I filmed the podcast. I thought that there was some other sort of relation. But yeah, so Gerry is a professor at the University of Tennessee in the McClung Museum. He is the McClung Museum Curator of Natural History and a professor of malacology. So, in this episode, we talk a lot about his work studying freshwater mussels, why they're so important to our river systems and our local bodies of water. Talk a little bit about why the diversity of freshwater mussels is so important. And then we kind of move into a discussion about my grandfather, who I think for both of us is probably our greatest influence and just, one of the most treasured men in both of our lives and a lot of people's lives. It was really interesting to get sort of a different look at the relationship because, from what I know, my grandfather was a man who raised me, but he worked closely with Gerry in aspects of cattle farming. Talk about building a barn, just a bunch of different cool stuff. So hope you guys enjoy. This is probably my favorite episode to date. I got a lot of ways to go to get this channel up and running, but I'm proud of the work I've put in so far. So that being said, this is Echoes of a Distant Time with Gerry Dinkins. Thanks. So I'm here with my with a family friend of mine, Gerry Dinkins, and so we're just gonna sit down and kind of shoot it for a bit. But yeah, so if you could just go into whatever relation there is between the Jenkins and Dinkins family, because I've always been interested. So
Well, you and I are third cousins.
Okay.
So your grandmother, Jean Lewis Dinkins, is my first cousin.
Okay.
So your father, Stephen, is my second cousin. So that makes you my third cousin. So I think they also call that we're first cousins twice removed. I think that's how that lays out. But so Jean was the oldest grandchild of Canada and Maggie Rogers. So Jean, your grandmother, was the only child of Canada and Maggie's firstborn, which was Fontella. And Fontella Rogers then became Fontella Lewis, is a sister to my mother.
Okay.
So
Nice little web.
You almost have to draw it out.
Yeah, you kind of do have to
sort
draw
of
it out.
see it well.
Yeah. I didn't never really knew if it was family friends or if it was family, but I guess we are family. So yeah, but other than that, I've been doing some research on your work, and I got to watch, I guess, the lecture you and Barbara gave a few years ago. So I watched that yesterday. But I know other than this, you're a guess like an expert in malacology, something that I don't hardly know anything about. But I guess somewhere where we could start is so what is, I guess, the broad importance of freshwater mussels? Like, what do they do for our environment?
That's a little hard to answer because trying to assign worth to an animal or to a group of animals is kind of a human objective or a human perception. But my particular area of interest and expertise is really with freshwater mussels. So malacology is a broad category. Malacology is the study of mollusks, and mollusks is a phylum, mollusca, and that includes a lot of different groups, like squids and octopus and gastropods or snails and bivalves, clams and mussels, and then so mussels are sort of a subset within that larger group. And I also do a lot of work with freshwater snails.
Mm-hmm.
The importance of freshwater mussels in particular is that they're sedentary filter feeders that some species can live a long time, well over 100 years. And they're filter feeders. They have a complex life history or life cycle that's intertwined with other groups, for example, fish. And so freshwater mussels are sort of like the livers of the rivers, as they like to say.
Mm-hmm.
They're strong indicators of water quality, habitat integrity, and their presence in a river or a stream often is significant because it implies there's a good environment.
Mm-hmm.
And when they disappear locally or broadly or go extinct, that's something that we need to pay attention to
Mm-hmm.
because we all drink water, in some way or another. And if an animal that's absolutely tied to fresh water is starting to diminish in numbers and diversity,
Mm-hmm.
that might not portend well for our future. So a lot of effort is given to freshwater mussels on state and local scales to understand them, study them, and try to preserve them, try to conserve them, because we all want to live in a healthy environment, and they are strong indicators of a healthy environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That made me think of, so there's been a lot of, I guess, push on the internet to go towards more of like a nose to tail diet, what people call it, where they, people are trying to eat more red meat, but they're also trying to eat more liver and beef liver, chicken liver. And along with that, a lot of these dietitians promote oysters, which are, is that technically a, yeah,
It is a bivalve.
bivalve? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, that's interesting to me because, I guess liver of any sort is very important to the survival of a cow or the survival of a river. And no, I just thought that was kind of important. And I was reading Gordon's work the other day, and I finally thought of, is it anthropomorphism? Is that the
Human
term for applying
emotions onto a non-human
Mm-hmm.
entity.
Yeah, definitely.
Generally animals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But so yeah, what I guess goes into the conservation of freshwater mollusks?
Well, a number of things. One, you have to understand on sort of a genetic scale what a species is,
Mm-hmm.
and where a species occurs and how it's related genetically to other closely related species,
Mm-hmm.
so that you can understand where one species starts and or ends and another species starts, because you want to make sure you don't move an animal that's not supposed to be where it historically was, because it may mess up the gene pool of another species that's been
Mm-hmm.
genetically programmed or adapted to be in that world. So that's the first thing, is to understand what is a species and where they are. Second is to have a really clear understanding of where species occurred. And early on in the effort to conserve, freshwater mussels, there was an approach that involved moving mussels around. Let's say there was a mussel that was in Bull Run Creek,
Mm-hmm.
the Lewis Farm Creek. There was a mussel that historically occurred there, but is no longer there.
Mm-hmm.
And there was another location where the same species occurred. And they would move it into. They thought, well, we'll just move that one back into Bull Run Creek, only to later find out that the population that they used, the source population, was actually a different species. So now there's a great effort to try to stay within like a certain drainage basin. If you're going to try to recover a species, try to stay within that drainage basin, because that drainage basin has unique geological and water chemical properties that may have been that species that was in that creek was adapted for.
Mm-hmm.
So there is, to conserve mussels, there is moving of mussels, and now there's a lot more effort to propagating them in laboratories.
Mm-hmm.
And just about every state in the Southeast has one or more state hatcheries that are dedicated to freshwater mussels.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a burgeoning industry, if you will, and they're being quite successful with it. The problem they often run into is these hatcheries have gotten really good at raising mussels,
Mm-hmm.
Breeding them in the laboratory, transforming them on their host fish, and then growing them up to a size that they can then put into a stream. There are not many streams where you can put them in. If they've been wiped out of a stream, oftentimes that stream, the reason that the mussel went extinct, those reasons are still there.
Mm-hmm.
So you're just going to be putting a mussel back into its historic habitat, and it's the same thing's going to happen again. It'll just disappear. Mm-hmm. So anytime you're going to try to conserve a species and reintroduce it, you have to pair that with a restoration of the habitat, and at least try to understand and know why the species went extinct or extirpated to begin with,
mm-hmm.
so that the species has a chance to get established again. In Tennessee, we have 141 species of freshwater mussels, based on current taxonomy, and fully about 70% of those 141 species are imperiled. That means they are, declining, or have been extirpated from our waters, or have gone extinct.
Mm-hmm.
We have 15 species out of the 141 that are completely gone now, and all 15 species that went extinct were species that were, for the most part, restricted to shoal habitat in the main channel of Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Well, if you think about it, there's no shoal habitat left in either of those rivers, because those rivers have been dammed up by TVA and Corps of Engineers. So there's nothing you can do to restore those species, plus they're extinct. So, but a lot of the restoration effort that's going on in Tennessee now is really aimed at recovering the mussel fauna in sort of the secondary rivers, the tributary rivers,
mm-hmm.
Like the rivers that drain to the Tennessee, but are not part of the main channel of Tennessee, because a lot of those rivers have significant lengths of water that are still free flowing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I know that was a long answer to a short question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I guess the hope is to kind of reestablish the fauna in the tributary rivers, and then hope that travels downstream, I guess, or is it kind of a lost cause for the bigger ones?
So mussels have this intricate relationship with freshwater fish,
mm-hmm.
In that freshwater mussels evolve from marine species, marine bivalves, and in the marine world, marine bivalves are for the most part hermaphroditic. So the sexes are combined in one individual animal. So when they would go to reproduce, they would spew out their babies, which would float around and then settle back down.
Mm-hmm.
And they lived in a world, or they live in a world where you might have a current going one way, but it may come back the other way because of tidal influence or changes in flow patterns. But as they invaded freshwaters about, I think, 300 million years ago, bivalves encountered a world where you had unidirectional flow. So that strategy of spewing your babies out to let them float and then settle back down wouldn't work. So they evolved this relationship with putting their young onto fish, which then were able to swim upstream or maintain their place in current. And the larval mussels would parasitize the fish for a period of time, grow, and then eventually drop off. Some freshwater mussels are very specific in the host fish that they use. And if something happens to that host fish species, then the mussel, while it could still reproduce, it's not going to be successful in bringing young up to, adult size, because they're never going to get past that larval stage because their host fish is gone. A lot of mussels are generalists. They can use multiple species, but some are very, very specific in their host fish. So another aspect of trying to conserve freshwater mussels is you have to understand what its hosts are, and you have to know, is that host, or are those hosts still present in that creek or river? Because if they're gone, the mussel won't be able to reproduce successfully. So for me, I'm actually not trained as a malacologist. I became a malacologist in a sort of a sideways way. I was trained as an ichthyologist. I studied freshwater fish for my master's degree, and then kind of went sideways into malacology. So I brought a certain expertise to malacology that some other malacologists might not have, and that's because I understand fish taxonomy and still work with fish a fair amount.
So I don't know much about it, but is that maybe kind of I guess the reproduction of mollusks, was that maybe kind of intertwined with the whole TVA snail darter situation? Or was it not involved, or what?
No, there were kind of separate aspects of the TVA snail darter controversy that were unrelated to freshwater mussels, but the snail darter is named the snail darter because its primary food is a small mollusk, a snail, the onyx rock snail, the Leptoxys praerosa. And interestingly enough, there is a freshwater mussel that uses darters to host its young, and this mussel creates an artificial lure on the edge of its shell, the females do, that looks just like the snail that the snail darter eats, and it's waiting for a darter, like a snail darter, to come up and try to eat that lure. And once the female feels the pressure on that lure, then she releases her young into the mouth of the snail darter. So when TVA dammed up Tellico, and it basically flooded many miles of a free-flowing river, and there were a lot of mussels in there that similarly were extirpated, as was the snail darter, from the main channel of the Little Tennessee River. As TVA improved how they release water from their dams, the water quality of not just that river, but other rivers in the state of Tennessee that TVA controlled have improved. And as a result, the snail darter has, it hung on in other places. And the snail darter now has its distribution and its numbers have increased as a result of TVA's efforts to improve their tailwater releases. So it's been a success. Even though the story of the snail darter was a story of an agency intent on changing a river from a free-flowing river into a reservoir, It's also a story of TVA recognizing that there's things that they can improve.
Mm-hmm.
Even though they've dammed up and flooded the valley, they've improved water quality with their habitat management and tidal water release. It's also a story of success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so, there's been a big push, I guess, in the world to move towards more clean energy and away from coal and fossil fuels. But you've always got to, weigh the uh, the risk reward ratio, and so with these fossil fuels, or dirtier, I guess, forms of energy, you have to weigh whether heating thousands of people's homes is worth the damage you do to the environment. Um, so roughly, like the way you see it, what is the risk to reward ratio of damming up these rivers?
That's a really good question, Sam. I mean, you know, we're sitting here using electricity.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a realist. I know that uh, I like having heat on. I like having the lights on. So I know that there's things that I enjoy that run contrary to uh, the desire to protect everything, which you can't do. So it's more to me. It's more like picking your battles. Finding the things that you can conserve and protect, and so that risk to reward is more uh, where can we do better? There's some things you're not going to be able to do. You're not going to return the Tennessee River to a free flowing river. It's
Mm-hmm.
just not. I don't think that could ever happen. There'd be too much public opposition. It just won't happen. So, what can we do to those reservoirs to improve them? And TVA is doing a lot. They really are. Uh, what can we do to save the sections of rivers that are below dams? A great example of what TVA could do is to change how they manage Cherokee Dam reservoir release. You've got 40 something miles of free flowing Holston River below Cherokee Dam that basically is severely impacted by the cold water release of Cherokee and by their pulse flow discharges.
Mm-hmm.
And the habitat's intact. So if TVA could just modify how they operate Holston River, you could put just about any rare endangered mussel that occurred in the Tennessee River system, you could put into Holston, because the Holston was one of, if not the most diverse mussel communities on the planet. Muscle Shoals, Alabama has always been held up to be the single most diverse mussel community.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember the number of species that historically was determined to be there. The Holston River rivaled. It was just a few species less than what was at Muscle Shoals. And the thing about Muscle Shoals, though, is most of that habitat is now underwater or severely damaged. The lower Holston River, the lower 40 miles of the Holston River, is basically intact. So that's, to me, there's a great ratio of reward to risk by having that dam change in how it releases its water.
Mm-hmm.
To me,
And so you said cold water release. What are the options, I guess?
it's a hypolimnetic release. They're releasing water from the bottom of the reservoir,
Mm-hmm.
and so that would have to be some sort of mixed profile release, instead of releasing water from the bottom of the reservoir and then aerating as it's releasing, so that you can't have some fish community below that dam. It needs to be a mixed profile. So release some water, combine the bottom discharge with the middle profile and the surface profile, so it's more closely akin to a normal temperature regime.
Mm-hmm.
Then, instead of having this huge discharge that then goes flat. It needs to be moderated somehow. Now, I'm not an engineer. I don't know how they can do that, but TVA's got some of the brightest minds there are. So I'm sure that could be figured out.
Yeah.
That's if there's one thing I would like to see before I retire or die, that's what I would like to see. That's to me, and it would do so much to conserve freshwater mussels, not just here, but in other places, because it could be used as a model. There are 2 endangered species of mussels still hanging on in the Holston River, the sheep nose and the pink mucket. And there's a few mussels that are hanging on as you get farther down the river, closer to the confluence with the French Broad, the backwaters from Fort Loudon Reservoir. You start seeing some mussels, but it's such a limited reach now that, and those mussels are not, most of them are not reproducing or can't because their host fish are gone or the temperature is so messed up. But those mussels that are still there basically are ones that have been hanging on since Cherokee was built in 1943 or something like that.
Okay. And so I remember the first day I ever saw you on campus, I was walking into the McClung Museum. And that was, hi, how are you?
What?
I give you a plate.
Thank you.
She's fine. But yeah, I remember I'll leave that in, by the way, that was cute. But I remember the first time I went in, I was walking into my final I somehow ended up in Anthropology 101 as a senior. And
yeah, I remember.
So, the one thing I remember from that, or not the one thing, I remember quite a bit, but this kind of raised the question in me: are you more of a splitter or a lumper? Comes to
That's a good question. Well, I'm not really a taxonomist per se in terms of mussels. I guess I'm really neither. But there is a certain breakdown between the two. I would say for the most part, those of us that have declared themselves to be splitters have mostly been proven correct by genetics. Not all. There's examples of where what we once thought was multiple species is one. So I'm kind of in the middle, yes, because in the early years of freshwater mussel taxonomy, there was a rush to describe species so that in for the most part, to get your name on it. That has swung back. It swung from that initial splitting to more of lumping, and now it's somewhere kind of in the middle as we resolve genetic analysis. I lecture on that. I have a lecture in my malacology class where I talk about early mussel taxonomists, and there was one, Isaac Lee, who, to my way of thinking, he played on the vanities of people. This was in the early, mid 1800s. He played on the vanities of people that would send him specimens that they found in their creek or river, and he named a lot of species. He created a lot of patronyms, so he named a lot of species after somebody, and mostly he was naming them after the people that would send him specimens, and this was a way that he could get them to send him more specimens. There's one species of mussel called the eastern elliptio. Occurs on coastal areas of North and South Carolina, Virginia. This one species, what we now know as one species, he described 95 times. So there's 95 names associated with that one mussel. And if you work in taxonomy, one of the things you've got to do is understand what are all the names that are associated with one species. And so you have to sort of capture that in what's called a synonymy before you can move forward. so that you don't have these names floating around that no one knows what to do with. I'm involved with the project right now with a couple of colleagues where we're working on the synonymy of the freshwater mussels of Georgia. And because of Isaac Lee and his work early on in the 1800s, he's created some real messes. And so we're trying to clean that up before we can move forward with a project on writing a book on the freshwater mussels.
But yeah, can switch gears here in a little bit, but I guess if there's some broad statement you could make about your work. I know you brought up the aspect of the Cherokee Dam, but if there's any other broad statement you'd like to make, just for the average person who's knows probably nothing about freshwater mussels like me, if you want to make it, feel free. But
Okay.
we'll move on here in a minute.
I guess if there's one statement I can make is that be appreciative of what's there. Be curious. If you find a specimen, a dead shell, bring it to somebody's attention. Bring it to me. Chances are it's going to be a specimen that's worthy of keeping, and it'll be archived and cataloged at the University of Tennessee's collection, and your name will go on it, as the collector. So a little bit of history, the collection at UT, we have material that goes back, modern material that goes back to the early 1800s. And it's kind of cool to know that there's a specimen in a museum that's going to have your name on it for perpetuity. So be appreciative of flowing water. I guess that's it.
Yeah. I've had Kirk on, and he lives his life in the flowing water. So definitely be appreciative.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I'll kind of switch gears a little bit here. And I'll sort of talk about my reasons for doing this, because I feel like you've got a lot you can teach me about. But I guess ever since my grandfather died, he has been my greatest inspiration. I feel like I was really wasting a lot of my potential, living, the average college life of going out and partying on the weekends and skipping class and this and that. But when he died, I snapped straight into adulthood. I remember the exact moment he died, I felt some sort of familial responsibility pass on to me, and everything kind of started to make sense, because I was just going with the flow of life, trying to enjoy things. And then when he died, I really have started to focus more on my work and family and these type of things. But I feel like you've obviously had a much longer relationship with him than me, and a working relationship along with the familial relationship. So I guess what did my grandfather mean to you? And if you've got any funny stories, feel free to share them.
Your grandfather meant a lot to me, and some of my earliest memories involve him, because your grandmother, Jean, Glen's wife, Jean and my mom were very, very close. And then when Jean and Glen got married, probably pretty close in time to when my mom and dad got married. And so I grew up, my sister and I spent a lot of time with your grandparents. They were like a second set of parents to me. And even though your grandmother's my first cousin, Jean's firstborn, Kathy, was actually older than me. So we used to, vacation together. We traveled together. They lived just down the road from us. So we were together a lot. The families were. And one of my strongest memories, and I don't know how old I was probably about 5 years old. It's the only time I ever saw your grandmother get mad at your grandfather, when Jean got mad at Glen. and we were at their house when they lived on Faust Kearney Road, and we were in the kitchen, and see how this your grandfather had some ground pepper, and he told me to hold my hand out, and so I held my hand out, and he poured this pepper into my hand, and then he said, "Now, smell it." And so when I went to smell it, he blew, and it blew in my nose, and I started coughing, and he thought it was kind of funny. Your grandmother got so mad at him. She just, it flew all over her. It's the only time I ever saw her get mad at him. So, I lived away after I got out of graduate school. I wound up different places, and then finally wound up in Pennsylvania, and I lived up there for 8 years or so, and I moved back. And then after my mom and dad died, I decided I wanted to rehab our family property into what it used to be, which is it was a little mini farm. And so your grandfather, Glenn, was my inspiration. He, every little aspect of, creating a farm, building a farm, running a farm, I got from him. My father, who actually grew up on a subsistence farm, he was, by the point in the time that I wanted to sort of do that, his Alzheimer's was so bad he really couldn't help me.
Mm-hmm.
But oh, they are. We have a flock of wild turkeys. And in the front yard, oh my gosh, look down there, Sam.
Oh yeah, quite a bit. That's crazy. I had one walk right in front of me at the on Kingston Pike the other day. That's crazy.
Oh my God, a bunch of toms. They're all toms.
Crazy.
When I started, I wanted to build a barn, and I picked a site out, and I told Glenn, and Glenn said that he would design the barn for me. So I had a friend come over with a bobcat, a skid loader, whatever, and clear out the pad, the building site for it, and spent a lot of time having that done. And Glenn comes out and he looks at it and he says, "Is that where you want to build that barn?" I said, "Yeah, that's where I want to build the barn." And he says something like, "Well, why do you want to build it there?" I said, "Well, I think that's be the best place for it." He goes, "Well, this is how Glenn would always sort of instruct me. He'd say, "Well, you can do it." Yes. I see them. Yeah.
There's a lot
of them. Oh. So he says, as this is the way he would always sort of instruct me. Well, now, if that's where you want to build a barn, then you should build a barn there. If it was my barn, I would not build a barn there. And I would obviously say, "Well, where would you build it?" He'd say, "Well, I'd build it right over there." I'd say, "Why?" And then he would give me all these reasons, but he wasn't going to hard sell what it is I wanted to do, or how he wanted me to do it differently. He would allow me to make up my own mind. And I'd always eventually follow his advice. And so he started drawing up plans. I still have them. He drew them up by hand. Occasionally I'd come over to your grandparents' house, and he and I would sit there at the dining room or the kitchen table, and he'd say, "Well, now what do you want?" And so I would, tell him what my dream was for the barn. And so he would start drawing, and he drew this barn design by hand.
Yeah.
Just I mean, down to the detail, lengths, ratios, angles, just all in his head. And so he did it in stages. The first stage was like the ground floor, the corners, because there's going to be a pole barn. And it was also being built on existing grade, so it's on a slight slope, which makes it infinitely harder because you're not dealing with a flat surface. So you're going to build something that's got to be perfectly vertical on a surface that's not perfectly horizontal. And so I started building it, and there'd be times when I'd be sitting there holding his blueprint, like trying to and he'd retired by then, but he's still a busy guy. You never saw Glen Jenkins sit.
Nope.
And
Nope.
I would debate whether or not to call him, and because I knew he had stuff he was doing, so I'd call him and say, Glenn, I said, I'm puzzled about what you're indicating in this part. And he'd say, I'll be right there. And I mean, literally 10 minutes later, he'd be coming down the driveway.
Yep.
And so I would explain to him what I thought needed to be done. And he would kind of look at me, he goes, well, you could do it that way. And I said, well, is that the way you do it? No, that's not the way I do it. But if you want to do it that way, you can do it that way. But that's not the way I said, well, how would you do it? So then he would explain to me like, oh, that makes much better sense. That happened. I can't tell you how many times that. And so I remember, I don't know, you were there, at the funeral service when I was asked to speak some words. And about halfway through the building of that barn, I got sick. I got really badly sick. And I probably got sick from my work. I'd spent a lot of time that year or the year before in Ohio diving in really nasty rivers doing mussel surveys, and I got something in me that basically my lower intestine started failing on me, and I had to go into some emergency. I was in the hospital for weeks, emergency surgery to remove part of my colon, and the whole time I was in the hospital, thinking about two things. One, I hope I survive this. And secondly, I got to get out and get better and get this barn built because, to make Glenn proud of me. I really wanted to make Glenn proud of me. So that was a driving force that probably saved my life, was to try to make Glenn proud of me.
Yeah. It was it's a driving force I have every day. He's one of the first thoughts of the day because I wear his watch every day, and yeah, he's a big inspiration. And you were talking about his how good he was with drawing up blueprints. I mean, I didn't deal with it as closely as you did, but even his handwriting, I remember, was so geometric. Everything was so perfectly laid out like a math problem. And yeah, I remember you bring up the time that Gene got mad at him. I remember the only time he ever really yelled at me was when I was probably 10 or 11, and we were vaccinating the cattle, and I think I broke 3 different needles right on the backs of these cattle because I couldn't. I don't know if I was strong enough or if I wasn't hitting it at the right angle, but he ripped me apart because I know those needles are expensive, but he was always, very quick to praise and very slow to get on to you. So he was a great man, and like I said, he's my inspiration, and he's the reason I'm putting these things together in my life, and yeah, just love him dearly, and in one way or the other, he's still with us.
He
So,
is.
But yeah, we can wrap it up or do whatever. I know she's gonna get picked up here in a bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was good talking to you. I appreciate it. It's fun to learn all these different stories and about your work. And yeah, if you've got any parting messages, feel free. But we can wrap it up, whatever you want.
Well, I mean, this house, Glenn would come over here and I would talk about the things I'm doing with this house to try to maintain history. Like this floor here
Mm-hmm.
is from a skating rink that was up on Clinton Highway that we used to go skating on. And I thought it was important to try to save a little bit of history. And Glenn would always sort of share my sentiment about preserving the past and looking to the future, but really maintaining a strong appreciation of the past, which is kind of what you're doing with the podcast. But we had many time, here in the dining room talking about how to reuse things and be conservation minded and preserving the past. So this boat here was built by my wife's father. There's, this room is filled. The grandfather clock was in my parents' house, and I had that rehabbed and conserved. Yeah, I share Glenn's sentiments about understanding the past and doing what you can to preserve it.
Yeah, that's what the name of my channel is. It's a Pink Floyd lyric, but it's also it rings true. Echoes of a Distant Time, because I feel like we have a lot more to learn from the past in order to kind of create a better future. At least when you look backwards, you can figure out what's worked and what hasn't. I feel like when you look too far in the future, you're kind of just throwing things randomly. You can create a lot of chaos when you live too idealistically. But if you look back at what has worked and what will continue to work, then I think you can build a much more sustainable future. So, but yeah, it was good talking to you. I've never really had a sit down conversation with you, so it's good to get to know you. We'll definitely try to develop more of a relationship.
Yeah, let's do that.
Yeah. But yeah, we'll go ahead and wrap it up here. Alrighty.